What's up everybody, it's Isaac with Midwest Madness, and today I'm going to tell you the 5 best pre-rut whitetail hunting tips that you could ever need to know. Stick around to the end of the video. I'm going to have a bonus tip for you guys that I think you're going to like. So let's get into it. Over the years, there's obvious tactics that work and there's tactics that don't work. With whitetail hunting, sometimes you have to think out of the box. Right now we're in the October lull. We're in a period where, the deer aren't moving as much or they're sticking closer to their home range. So you have to get a little bit creative. My tip number 1 for hunting pre-rut whitetails is to locate the food. Now I know that might sound simple to you, but if you're a whitetail hunter and you're hunting public land, private land, whatever, it's critical to know the feed that these whitetails are feeding on in your particular area. Right now I'm in Montana, so there's not a ton of mast crop up here, but there is a lot of fresh green shoots and some ag land around. So that's priority number 1 for me. If I'm back in the Midwest, which I assume most of you guys probably are, or even in the Southeast, what I would be looking for is your oaks, your white oaks, red oaks, chinkapin oaks, whatever oaks are dropping at this time of the year in your area is where I would be locating number 1, because when you find the feed, you're going to find the does, and the does lead into tip number 2. Tip number 2 is find the doe bedding areas. This kind of goes overlooked sometimes by a lot of people, but in the pre-rut, typically you'll have bucks that are moving about. They're gonna check these bedding areas. They're going to be just making their rounds, and basically they're trying to make their rounds so one day when they come around finally, they're going to get that whiff of estrus and they're going to know that there's a doe in heat somewhere in the area. So by locating those doe bedding areas, typically they're going to be adjacent to the food. So along with tip number 1, if you can find the food, you can find the oaks, you're going to want to back out, follow those feed trails, back out. Typically you're going to find there's some thicker cover nearby, maybe some cedars, maybe some just really tall CRP, something like that. And you're gonna find these bedding areas. So what you should do is, you can look for buck bedding, but in my opinion, I think you should look for groups of doe bedding where those bucks are gonna be at. And then that plays into tip number 3. Tip number 3 is you wanna figure out the thermal hubs in your area. So within the feeding, and then you backtrack that to your doe bedding, you need to find the thermal hubs in the area. So what that means is basically you're going to find an area where the wind seems to either pool or there's maybe a bowl or a couple of ridge tops that come together, and basically what that's going to do is it's going to feed those thermals down into almost a little funnel. And what those deer are going to do, especially those bucks, they're going to use those thermal hubs to scent check for does. So they're going to be cruising around, and say you have a ridge top with oaks, and then you've got some doe bedding maybe on the opposite hillside and some cedars, and then you have a bowl down below in this thermal hub where all these thermals are pulling down into. You're going to find that there's likely some side hill buck trails pretty close by where those bucks are usually cruising by, where they can smell any deer that are up in the feed, any deer that are in the bedding, and any potential danger. So they're going to feed through there, and they're going to use those to scent check. That is a primary spot to intercept a pre-rut whitetail. That's going to lead me into tip number 4. Tip number 4 is stand placement, or on the ground placement. So in your stand placement during this pre-rut time frame, typically what I like to do is I don't like to sit on the feed or the doe bedding or whatever. Typically I like to set up where I've got a good shot at one of these side hill trails where these deer are going to be using for thermal. They're going to be scent checking the wind. They're going to be cruising these thermal pathways. I like to set up typically, obviously you want to be on the downwind side, but to me, if you're going to be hunting this spot in the morning, you got to think about the thermals. So the thermals are usually pulling down still in the morning until the sun hits the opposite hillside, when the thermals will reverse and they'll go up the hill. So typically, if I'm going to be playing like my typical pre-rut spot where I think these deer might be cruising by, when they're scent checking, I want to be down below the suspected area of where I think those bucks are going to go as those thermals are pulling downhill. And then it just depends. If you're seeing deer movement in your area a little bit later in the morning, then you want to be uphill of that. But it's always smart to play the thermals. So tip number 4, play the thermals. Make sure that you're using those to your advantage either in the morning, evening, or mid-morning as they switch. Those big bucks are going to be super keyed in on that. My tip number 5 is don't overdo it. A lot of people will go in, they might have a spot, they might be really confident about one particular area, but to me, the best thing you can possibly do in the pre-rut is let those areas sit until you have a perfect weather conditions, perfect wind conditions. But a lot of people will go in there early because they're eager about hunting a certain spot, and then those big bucks will catch their scent. And when they catch the scent, usually if it's a big, smart, old, mature buck, they're not gonna stick around very long. So hunt smart. That's tip number 5 is super important, because if you're going in there and you're hunting on a subpar weather day, you might tip off those big bucks to your presence, and then they might be on the neighbor's property, or they're just not gonna frequent that area in the daylight. And for those of you that stayed till the end, my tip number 6, the bonus tip that I think you're really gonna like, and this is what I personally do, so let's look around, make sure nobody else is listening but you guys. Tip number 6, hunt the thickest, nastiest stuff you possibly can find. A lot of the times when I'm hunting, I've hunted lots of big private ag, I've hunted lots of public land, and the majority of the time, the place where I find the biggest bucks are in the thickest, nastiest drainages, draws, creek bottoms, things where you don't think there's going to be a big deer in. And that's usually where they're hiding, because those deer are so smart, they're gonna know where the pressure is, where the stuff is. So if I was you, I would hunt the thick stuff, maybe, look for thick drainages, and one thing that I like to do is in between two fields. So in between two fields, there might be a little drainage, and you might think, well, there's not any deer in there, there's nothing to hold them there, it's not very big, what have you. But a lot of times those big bucks know that, and they're gonna be bedded up in there, and they're just gonna come out to cruise in the evenings, whatever, where they can scent check. But if you can hunt those thick, nasty spots where those deer are bedded at, there's a good chance that you're gonna be able to capitalize on a big buck this fall. So I hope those tips helped you guys. Those are tips that have helped me. It's not rocket science, guys. It's really not. So don't overthink it. That's another thing. Don't overthink it. Hope you enjoyed those 5 tips, though. I'm going to be coming back with a lot more awesome content. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and a subscribe. And good luck out there in the woods this fall. Thank you, guys, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Midwest Madness. Peace.